Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the Eon podcast. We've been joined today by Dr. Asim Qureshi. Doctor, how are you doing?
Assalamu alaikum. Yes, alhamdulillah. Well, yourself?
Walaikum salam. Welcome to the show. Dr. Asim is a British legal expert who specializes in international and Islamic law. He serves as the research director at CAGE, a UK-based advocacy organization dedicated to empowering communities affected by the war on terror. And you have a PhD in international conflict analysis, right? So, I mean, your work, and you've written some notable books about your works as well. Rules of the Game, Detention, Deportation, Disappearance, A Virtue of Disobedience, I Refuse to Condemn, Resisting Racism in Times of National Security, When Only God Can See, The Faith of Muslim Political Prisoners. First and foremost, what inspired you to do the work that you've been doing in terms of advocacy? And I mean, it's pretty obvious that you've been working on the war on terror, but what was it particularly with your life or your individual experiences that motivated you to get into this line of work?
Yeah, thanks. Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. No, thanks for the question. I think the first thing to start off with is to say that really it's my parents who always raised my brothers and I to have a sense of, kind of helping the community in whatever way we can. We grew up around a number of people, especially a lot of like slightly older young Muslim men who went and fought in places like Bosnia and Afghanistan during the 80s and 90s. So we had a lot of good role models in our lives, my brothers and I. And although, initially when I was studying law, I wanted to go into corporate law and, kind of just do that whole, normal corporate life thing, while of course being connected to the community in different ways. It was really 9/11 and the images of Muslim men in their hundreds being, having these hoods placed over them, big earphones on their knees and a prostrating position with guns over their heads. Those images when they came out in kind of early 2002, that really shifted my mentality towards thinking that I really didn't want to work on kind of corporate law for the rest of my life. Instead, that I really wanted to try and give back in some way, to use the international law that I was studying that purported to be about human rights and human dignity, to try and use that to help those people. And so I changed all of the modules that I was supposed to do in corporate law for my master's to ones in relation to human rights law, international humanitarian law, the laws of armed conflict. And then I did my master's dissertation on Guantanamo in 2003. And so I've been focused on that since from then till now.
Right, so would you say the war on terror radicalized you to...
Yeah, absolutely. Well, George Bush radicalized me.
to give up a career in corporate law and turn your focus on advocacy work and activism. It's a very provocative image. I think a lot of young people who are listening to the podcast right now wouldn't be as affected by those images like you mentioned as you and I would have been, of Muslim men being made to kneel over and wearing those earmuffs and eye goggles and orange jumpsuits. And it's a very iconic, in a very perverted sort of sense, image. And I think it's defined a lot of our lives in the last 20, 30 years for most Muslim men, whether in the diaspora or whether within the Muslim world. What about them? And like you mentioned, the sort of the glory days of the international jihad that you witnessed as a young man when you saw older men coming back from Bosnia or Chechnya or wherever, and you saw honor in that and dignity in that. And then now you saw the complete paradigm shift where the empire, now the Americans, NATO, is coming down on the Muslims, and it's another international jihad or conflict. Why do you think the response to it was so different? It had the same sort of effect, galvanizing a lot of young men to go and fight the Americans in Iraq or in Afghanistan or wherever, but something about the perception of the Muslim man changed. And do you think that was what particularly irked people like you to do something about it?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the hypocrisy of it was very, very stark. In some cases, it was very personal. So, for example, a very close friend who I looked up to, like an older brother, Babar Ahmed, here in the UK, grew up very close to us, was literally like a pastoral figure as an older brother in our lives. He's the one who, went to Bosnia. He went to different places and documented what was taking place. That taught us about what was happening. And it wasn't like now where, the moment a bomb drops on a Palestinian family, you within seconds you can see the images of that taking place. We were hearing about the mass rapes of the Bosniak people and the destruction of them months later, watching like videos on VHS tape, which many of your viewers will be too young to know what that is and remember. And then, of course, during that whole period of 90s, you had so many different conflicts. But I think I was always suspicious of this idea of American involvement, because it always seemed to me throughout that whole period that the West would only intervene once everyone was dead. That was the moment of intervention. Like they would wait and wait and wait, until like there was mass slaughter taking place, and then they would intervene. And of course, if you kind of read about, watch documentaries or movies on Bosnia or Rwanda or any of these kind of conflicts, you see that happen consistently over and over and over again. So there was always this suspicion that I had. And then, of course, with after 9/11, you have this discourse emerging that specifically targets the Muslim man as the central most evil in the world. And it isn't just what they believe in, it's a pathology that's in the body, but also in the belief at the same time. So every single aspect of who we are as Muslims, whether in the East or in the diaspora, became securitized. And so that's really what changed here. It was, 9/11 did change a lot. Was the Muslim considered to be an out and out hero before then? I wouldn't say so. I think, of course, you go through Edward Said's work and multiple scholars over the years, they show from the time of the Crusades through the Reconquista all the way until now, the Muslim man in particular has always been the subject of intense xenophobia. But the war on terror just heightened that. It literally placed that entire thing on crack.
Right. So the dehumanizing of the body as well as the ideology. So it was both ideological and racial at the same time, in that the brown, the Turk, the Arab, the South Asian, Indian, Pakistani, whatever, they're other than, like, physically they're different, they're detached, they're apart from us. And then on top of that, there was this idea of a radical Islam, radical jihad, international jihad, whatever you want to call it. There's something unique about these people as a threat to Western civilization or to Europe as the continent, or whatever you want to call it. Did you feel that at home? Were you able to reconcile your Britishness with your Islam? Was that one of the motivating factors, do you think?
And I've never really struggled with this question at all, actually. I know a lot of people have. A lot of people can be like, oh my God, like I've had this existential crisis. Am I more Muslim or am I more British? For me, there was never any, like, I always found that really interesting and this happened to a lot of people. So I'm not trying to negate their experience. It just didn't happen to me. I think partly it's because, alhamdulillah, my parents, they worked very hard to send my brothers and I to one of the best schools in the UK. And we grew up around a lot of white boys who came from very, very, very privileged backgrounds, but we were next to them. We were studying alongside them. We were given a very, very high level of education. But what comes with that education as well is this kind of like ultimate confidence in your own abilities. That's what you can get that education anywhere else, but there's a certain kind of, I don't want to say arrogance, but there's a certain self-confidence that you gain from being in that environment where it doesn't allow you to ever allow anyone else to look down on you. And because I think our parents and our community had raised us with such a strong sense of what it meant to be a Muslim living in the world, that I never really struggled with that question. It was always, well, I'm Muslim first, always. Anything that's British about me is a cultural habit. So if I have a certain propensity to queue, okay, even when there's just madness at Lahore airport and I'm still trying to find a line to make my way to the immigration desk, right? Because there's something encoded in my DNA now that requires that line to exist and to like, patiently queue my way through, I'm going to do that because that's the culture that I've been imbued with. So those are always two separate things for me, and I never really struggled with them because Islam was always first. Like, I have a relationship to my God, and that supersedes anything else.
Fair enough, but did you find your Britishness come into question with the visuals of Tony Blair and Bush having those meetings? Did you feel like the whole migratory process was a mistake?
Was the migratory? I think the migratory process was Allah's qadr for us to grow up inside the colonial metropole and you know be a painful reminder for them for everything that they did. And I think being here, we have a responsibility to that specific qadr of Allah, whatever you want to call it. You want to call it rizq, whatever you want to call it, but it comes with obligations. We are here, we exist here, we grew up with their culture, we read their books, we rejected their ideologies, and we have a responsibility to educate them about Islam, but also to hold up a mirror to them to say, you you claim a lot about yourselves, but we, those of us, especially those of us who grew up here, who were born here, who were raised here, we're here to remind you that it's actually not that great. That there are other ways of thinking, there are other ways of being in this world. And I think that's just the material reality of our existence in the West. You know, one of our scholars here, Dr. Sahel Hanif, he talks about Muslims in the West being in a form of Rabat, that our connection to the Muslim world is that we stand at the periphery to defend Islam and to defend Muslims from the position that we have. And I really like that idea a lot. I really like the idea and the notion that, our existence here is based on our connection to the Ummah in some way. And that's of their own making, right? They're the ones who introduced themselves to us. We never knew about the West until they came over and colonized our lands and, stole our resources and everything else. And, we're here now, largely because of that. And so in some ways, this is their just desserts.
Right. I mean, there's a complaint that you do get from the European right now that all this immigration it's about like a reverse colonization and a revenge strategy on the part of the global South and blah blah blah. I mean, if we were that organized and if only we were that organized and we were so well thought out in our ideas, when it was simply a matter of demographics changes, political maneuvering, cheap labor and those things on part of their governments. But like you mentioned, that our interest in the West was as much as our interest in the East or the South or the North, and then they happened to come upon us and colonized us, and that introduced us to the West to the mainland, to the United Kingdom, to France, to Italy, whatever. And you said that it's a kind of Rabat for us, that we're at the peripheries of the Ummah, and our job is to use that risk, that barakat, those resources to then defend the Ummah and protect it in any way possible. And it seems that you are a manifestation of that in sorts, and you started this work specifically when I think one of the greatest, most most gross or obvious threats to the Ummah has risen in the last 50, 100 years since colonialism is the war on terror, perhaps. Maybe after the Soviet, Central Asian conquests, maybe. What did you find when you started working on this? Did you find your Western counterparts, your home, people from Britain, people from the West, did you find them to be hypocritical? Did you find them to be struggling, with this new threat of Islam or jihad or whatever, and they couldn't reconcile their own moral laws? What was the problem?
I mean, the problem is a structural one. Your everyday British person is actually quite quintessentially decent. They have a very strong sense of their own moral compass. When they meet you on an individual basis, they're able to communicate with you in a way that largely as permits them to put aside some of the deeper prejudices that they hold in order to do that direct communication. The classic line is, "It's not you, Abdul, it's the rest of them," right? Like it's a joke that we have over here, right? But
Yeah,
it's one that
you're
we've
one of the
all
good
heard.
ones.
Right, you're one of the good ones. It's not you. It's the rest of them, because they have this thing, right, where once they kind of get to know you a little bit, then it's okay. And that's why a lot of like Muslims in the UK, unfortunately, a lot of Muslim organizations put the emphasis on us that, oh, if we rectified our behavior, then they wouldn't have such a negative view of us, rather than understanding that actually the invective that it comes at a completely structural level. So it's perpetuated by a political class, through the media, institutionalized through policing, and the courts. There are so many elements to this that work in tandem with one another in order to create the visage of the troublesome, quarrelsome, problematic Muslims. But that's separate to those daily interactions. You can capture their imagination. You can capture their inherent decency in on a one-to-one basis. Even actually, if they're antagonistic towards you, you'll find that even those who like write articles about you and give speeches about you and whatever else, that if you corner them at a conference and start talking to them, then all of a sudden, and maybe like a little bit nifaq on their side, but they enter into a completely different type of dialogue with you in that moment. But what I think one of the things that we've struggled to understand is that there are concerted efforts taking place that have nothing to do with the British population. They are just soaking up what they hear from newspapers like the Daily Mail and whatever else. That prejudice that they have is something that is designed. It is not something that is inherent to them necessarily.
Right. And do you think that the reason why they're willing to buy into these kinds of narratives when they are presented, like you said, on a one-to-one level, you're able to capture their imagination and they're able to see that we're decent folk, just like them, just human beings trying to get along, living our lives. What's the reason why they're so enamored with these narratives when they are presented to them? Is there something wrong in the education system, in the environment, in the culture, in the legal framework? Like you mentioned, there's a bunch of different things, but if you had to pin it down to one, why is it that what I've found is that Muslims, far and wide, where I've interacted with them, they have a very decent understanding of the West and have a very nuanced understanding of them as a people. Whereas on the flip side, if a ridiculous sort of narrative is spun, Westerners gobble it up like very easily, hook, line, and sinker, without a second thought. En masse, I've observed this. What is it about? Is it privilege? Is it the first world is gullible? What is it?
I mean, I think we have to acknowledge that it is somewhat encoded in the ideology of liberalism. This kind of racism that they have. You only have to go back through the history of like Enlightenment thinking in order to see it very, very, very clearly. Like there is no doubt that they have never been able to move away from their ideas around phrenology, around it's very, very evident, in the way
And
that.
you've chosen to wear your hair like that to make it easy for them to assess or what?
Right, they can assess the shape of my head. Yeah,
Right.
that's right, without having to kind of shave my hair off. Right, that's precisely
It's
why I've
very
done
kind
that.
of you. I've been masking myself. I don't want to get
Yeah,
caught out.
absolutely. But they've never really been able to escape this, and actually what's happened is that those ideas are now coming back more powerfully than ever, again because it's a concerted effort to do so, and because it's easy. And we can, I don't think it's easy ever to say that there's one thing, right? Because it is economic. Like, let's look at Turkey, for example. Turkey is ostensibly a Muslim country, but it becomes very, very easy to demonize a population of refugees and migrants when things start to go bad. So when the economy was doing well, and Erdogan was doing well, and the economy was rising, they were even loaning money back to the IMF. They got to that stage, right, of their economy. Then at that point, it was, oh, the Uyghurs, you're our original ancestors. You're so welcome here. We welcome with you with open arms. Please come here, have sanctuary here. And the Syrians, you're our brothers, our neighborly brothers. Please come here. And there was that whole period Okay, and that was happening when the economy was very good. The economy tanks, and we have to just be honest and say that even those who ostensibly presented themselves as Islamic, right? I don't use the word Islamist, right? Were regurgitating certain narratives, not all of them, of course, all right, but they were regurgitating certain narratives which come straight out of a far right playbook, because it's one of the central features of nationalism that it is exclusionary. And the European project, the Western project, is one that has built its entire thinking, it is entire ideology around the nation state as a deified being. Right? Dalal Asad talks about this in secular translations, that when you remove religion from the equation and you deify the state, then the state has to be the final arbiter of all that is moral in society, right? It has to take on all public morality for itself, and therefore it has to militarize against its own population, because the only way that you can then be responsible for morality is if you are the one that enters into their private lives, and which is why they become surveillance societies, which is why they become in kind of military societies and mukhabarat societies. For these very reasons, it becomes sanctified and deified in a way that we as an Islamic have to move away from. And the nation state itself is the primary
So
vehicle for that.
the
And
nation
yeah,
state being sort of the defining Western characteristic of even the Muslim world in the way we're organized. Like you
absolutely.
pointed out, with Turkish nationalism, that was an inevitable outcome with the Uyghur, as well as the Syrian diaspora of refugees and migrants. That you had the same sort of attitudes that you would get out of any European or North American society, like in Canada or America or whatever.
Right.
And you, like you said, you had the same kind of racist overtones and undertones with regards to the accusations against the immigrant populations about how they're stealing our women and they're taking up all the jobs and they smell bad and their food's weird or whatever. And
Right.
that element, I think, is economic in as much as people organize themselves as nation states. That kind of economics only becomes a problem in that when you have these boundaries and that the nation state is the arbiter of. Because I had this very funny conversation with someone the other day, and I was in Islamabad, and this is like a high level, high ranking, serious journalist, and they said, the Afghans are a real problem. They do all the smuggling, and I was like, the drugs are pretty much over now that the Taliban is in power. So what aspect of the smuggling is a bother for you? He said, dollars and currency is moving, and so much wheat is moving illegally, and construction material, and it's all illegal. And he was saying illegal and juxtaposing that with haram, like it was a moral
Right.
evil. I said, and then I asked him, I said, what is smuggling? And I
Right.
found that he was very confused by it. I said, is smuggling haram? I asked him plainly, do you think smuggling haram? And he said, that's a really good, I never thought about it like that. I said, what is smuggling? What is a
Right.
border? Who decides that you can't move wheat from X point to Y point because there's an arbitrary line that we made up like 100 years
Right.
ago? So
Right.
I think deifying the nation state, like you mentioned, and a lot of great academics have been working on this in the Muslim world. At the same time, while I agree with your analysis, there's a criticism that comes from, surprisingly in Pakistan, from the left, the liberal left, because
Mhm.
they're really obsessed with ethno-nationalism and nation states and liberal institutions these days. That's their shtick these days. A criticism that comes is that this is all like wishy-washy, pie in the sky, rhetoric about something that cannot be. Like the genie's out of the bottle. We live in nation states. We organize
Mhm.
ourselves as liberal democracies or some form of them on the spectrum somewhere. So all this criticism is, it's sort of just it's a kind of intellectual masturbation, and what is this all about, anyways? Like, do you think within the popular imagination of the Muslim, is there a possibility of escaping this sort of paradigm for our own selves, for example?
Yeah, I think it has to happen gradually. Look, the reality is that people don't have any confidence in the system of laws that govern them. and there are all forms of like hierarchies taking place. You are never certain when you come in front of a court whether or not you will receive justice. And kind of in my reading of like kind of Muslim history, and actually, kind of wider than that as well. One of the things that I find consistently is that people generally find themselves happier with their situation when they know that they can stand before a court and receive a fair ruling based on what they're going through. Now, we in the UK, we live in a very, very kind of racist society, probably the least racist out of all of the European countries that we border and we're around generally. Like, you have to be fair. Out of all of the places to live in the West, probably the UK is the best to live as a Muslim. But we're talking about like gradations here, right? Like the best of a batch
As
that are
opposed to
pretty,
France, for example, like what a
as opposed to
ridiculous
France,
comparison.
right? Absolutely, and I tell French Muslims all the time that if you have the means and you have the resources and the language skills and so on and so forth, leave. There is no rescuing Muslims in France, as far as I'm concerned. It is a lost project. But it just depends on what your purpose for being there is, right? And so, many people they just don't care enough about anything other than just being able to pray at home. And for them, they will find probably for another 20 years, 10, 20 years, they'll still be okay doing that. Even as they face certain forms of racism. But there is still, like over here, there's still that element, even within that racism, that there is a process that you can follow to gain justice. But in all of our countries, this notion doesn't exist. It's not there. And I think there are elements to how we build that society, but the idea, the notion of what justice looks like, and there are, of course, there's economic justice, there's various social justice, there are various forms of justice that we're talking about, but just that ability to know what does the law say and where do I sit in relation to that law, that's so central. And unfortunately, we've lost that. We've lost that completely. And so, yes, people can say, "Oh, this is all just intellectual masturbation," right? But there are daily issues that we have to deal with, and as far as I can see, ultimately, yes, the nation state might have provided some degree of stability for a period, but ultimately, because it's exclusionary in its nature, it ends up moving towards the right. Every single example of it, or becoming some kind of like coup or a despotic regime, but always towards the right by virtue of its very nature. Because in order to be included, somebody has to be excluded at all times.
As
And
yeah,
you
as a
know,
totalizing
and the
entity.
question is, right, and the question is, the Prophet ﷺ was amongst us today. Would he be like, "Oh yeah, this is cool"? Like I can't enter Saudi Arabia because like somehow I ended up in Turkey, right? And so, right, like it's like, all right, Prophet, you're without a visa, you can't enter the Haram, right? Like, just like it's just like simple stuff, right? Like even myself, I don't travel to Saudi Arabia for various reasons because I brought a case against one of the members of the royal family. Alhamdulillah, I'm okay with it. Like I've never performed Hajj, unfortunately, but I performed Umrah before. And you have to like okay certain things with yourself, that Allah is most just, right? And that that land is ruled with a great deal of injustice. Um, you know, but ultimately, the notion that a Muslim could be excluded from the Haramain, by virtue of the situation that exists there right now, it's bizarre. It's bizarre that
And I mean, you should have thought about that before you dropped that bomb on me.
you sorry.
Maybe you should have thought about it before you dropped that bomb on me. I'm kidding. I've done the Hajj, so
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah, we can criticize the Saudi regime. Don't worry. Yeah, it's the thing is, and I want to get into the actual work that you've done with the black sites like Guantanamo Bay and the Egyptian
Yeah,
detention
sure.
centers. But yeah, it's a real, I think it's a real a problem that we have on our hands that people tend to ignore because, like you said, I think it's a very good framing device that if Rasulullah was here and then he couldn't go to Damascus because border issues or whatever, Would that be something that he'd say, yeah, this is really cool, guys. Great, social organization structures that you've created. I like these borders. Um, it doesn't make any sense from a historical or religious or moral framework. It only makes sense
Well, let's just
in,
talk about it from ethics.
yeah,
That's
just
it.
pure
That's all I'm
ethics, fine.
interested in, right? Now, ethically, where does this sit with the Quran itself? Like, if you and read the Quran from beginning to end, and you have some reading of the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and understanding of the early history of Islam and the way that the Sahaba interacted with one another, would any of them be okay with this as it stands? Now, there's two separate things, right? One is, is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala going to be okay with the fact that neoliberalism, nation states, and whatever else were ubiquitous in the world, and it's very difficult for the Muslim to make a change in that scenario? Some would say, yeah, like obviously we've got a system of fiat currency and interest-based systems and banking and whatever else. That, because it's ubiquitous, you have to then say that hopefully Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will forgive us for having to live through these times in these ways. The question is, would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive us for never having the irada, for having the intention to change it? And those are two separate questions to one another, right? One is about the material reality that you're facing. The other one is about what you desire in relation to your understanding of the world that you live in. And the two things are not the same, because at all times, like, the Prophet ﷺ told us that when we see an injustice, we at the very lowest form of iman is to hate that thing in our heart. But how many of us, if we have debit cards and credit cards, remind ourselves that actually I hate the fact that I have to use this banking system. I hate the fact that this banking system has this ubiquitous hold over my life where I can't even make a payment for a bill without having to interact with it. And so what happens to that lowest form of iman then, if we're not even kind of reminding ourselves cognitively that this thing that I'm forced to interact with as a durura, fine, we accept it. It's a durura. We understand that. But like, do we have that in our hearts that, yeah, this thing is a wrong, and a wrong that I would love to change one day, that Allah, please help me to be part of that solution one day. And that's where the biggest problem is, that when our ethics get fudged into the material reality. So all those leftists who are saying, oh, intellectual masturbation or whatever else, this, that, and the other, that completely puts aside, right, what our relationship is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is fine. Okay, you can even agree with them and say, yeah, fine, okay. Yeah, we have to just deal with what's in front of us. But does the conversation end there? And on an individual level, forget about on a societal level, just you as a person, are we reminding ourselves that this is important because I have a relationship directly to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And because Allah has never told me in the Quran anywhere that only when you amount a massive force and have massive amounts of resources and grow the greatest empire in history will then I grant victory to you. It's always the opposite. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us so consistently throughout the Quran the exact opposite message, which is, if you're by yourself and you're all alone and you come up against overwhelming odds, somehow something miraculous will happen, or that you will lose and that you will be successful in your loss, that you will die, or that you will be tortured, or that you will be in prison, and you will be the one that's successful. Because capitalism has taught us that material loss looks like loss, whereas the Quran gives us the exact opposite message. The material loss is meaningless to us. And
Allahu
it's
Akbar.
in those ethics, that we lose ourselves. Right? There's a
Did you?
difference
How did
between the
you? How did
ethical
you
relationship.
find? How did you find these men and women of Islam in these jails, in torture, in black sites, abducted from their homes? Did they perceive it as a victory? Did you find them? Did you find them on Islam? Was that a source of comfort for them? Did they find strength in it?
Yeah.
Because these people are strong. Don't like. I think the audience doesn't understand that. A lot of these stories that you get out of Guantanamo, a lot of these testimonies, people in Guantanamo or Egyptian jails or in other black sites in Uzbekistan or whatever, these are strong people. And I
They're the
think the word
freest people.
I think the word hero isn't inappropriate for any of them. Um, did you find
Yeah.
them to be sound in their promise of the reward from Allah? How did you find them? What kind of situations did you see these people in?
Thank you for asking that. So I just wrote a book with Dr. Wala Qawaisi, and we wrote it on the way that Muslim political prisoners in Egypt and in Guantanamo Bay, how they practice Islam. What is their relationship like to Allah? So the whole book, was to try and capture like the everyday elements of Islam. So whether it's, how do they understand their confinement, their custody, to how do they pray salah, make wudu, how do they make jama'ah with one another? What were their dreams like? How do they deal with their torture? And, how do they resist? Like all of these elements came together in this book. We don't paint a completely rosy picture. We don't purposely go out to say, oh, look at these people, their iman is so high all the time. They go through real moments of struggle with their deen. Yeah, there are moments when they have a crisis of faith, but they also tell us how they come out of that crisis of faith too. Like there was one Egyptian prisoner, he was reflecting on, like he was in a moment where literally he was just questioning everything about his qadr because the torture was so severe, because he was going through so much. And then he read the verses about Maryam alayhi salam when she says that I wish I were dead. And one of the three women promised paradise. And he reflects on that verse and he was like, subhanallah, literally that ayah was Allah's response to me. The one, as I'm standing there, I'm being through all of these rounds of torture in this Egyptian prison, and I'm hoping death for myself, and I'm questioning Allah's intention for me. And then I read this, and I'm like, this woman who went through so much pain through childbirth in such a tense environment as well, where she knows at the other end of it, people are going to be accusing her of all sorts, and she would rather that she died. It's such a remarkable thing, and he goes, that ayah changed everything for me. And then you have like,
the
Wala, who did
irony,
sorry.
the irony would be completely lost on the so-called Christian West, about a Muslim man in Western structures being tortured because of some Egyptian despotic regime, and he's finding inspiration from Maryam, the mother of Jesus, Isa alayhi salam, and he's feeling her pain and her shame in a way that maybe no Christian has felt in 2,000 years. And I think the irony
Right.
would be completely lost on these new trad Christian, like anti-immigration clowns.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was a very,
And
you know. Anyways, I'm sorry I cut you off. It was
no,
very,
no, it's okay. I was just going to tell you
yeah.
about, Wala, she did all of the interviews with the Egyptian prisoners, and she interviewed a girl, Layla, who actually writes the foreword to the book. She was 13 years old when she was first detained in Egypt. And so we got her and Omar Khadr, who was 15 when he was sent to Guantanamo, to kind of reflect on what it was like being teenagers and their understanding of faith being teenage prisoners. Layla, when she was 13 and her entry into the prison was awful, you can imagine how sick Egyptian prison guards are. They're torturing her using electric rods. And imagine a 13-year-old girl, yeah, she has it in her mind that I haven't prayed salah. And they're torturing her with electric rods, all over her body. And she thinks to herself, oh, okay, right. How do I pray in this situation? So for a moment she thinks, okay, let me ask them if they can stop for a while so that they can give me the opportunity to pray. But then has this whole conversation in her head where she decides, no, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to give them the opportunity to feel like they've done something for me here. So she prays the entire salah with her eyes in her mind while she's being tortured in this torture session. For me, like, there's so many layers of what's going on here. The first is that there is a 13-year-old girl who is thinking about this in the first place, right? And many of us will have like 13-year-olds in our lives. My own son just turned 14, and I'm like, my God, if he was being tortured, would he, like, mashallah, he prays and everything, alhamdulillah, but like, would he be cognitively aware enough about his relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he would be thinking about this? I don't know. I don't know because none of us, alhamdulillah, we've been in that. Most of us have never been in that situation. But one of the stories that has stayed with me since writing this book, and that's one of the things about writing this book that it makes
Is Layla out
it makes
now?
yeah, she is, alhamdulillah. That's why we were able to interview her. But like it really
What
makes
was her purported crime?
they said that she was part of the protests at Rabat. So all of the interviews that are done are post Rabat with the Egyptian prisoners. So after the Rabat massacre, where General Sisi's forces killed 1,000 of the Ikhwan, there were like tens of thousands of political prisoners that were picked up, and she was one of them. And she was detained at the age of 13, then 15, and then 18 as well. So she went through a very long period of various detentions, and all of them quite abusive. But honestly, subhanallah, in some ways, political prisoners, those in Guantanamo, those in Egypt, and other places around the world, in some ways they are freer than the rest of us because they do understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's promise to them. And they embody the command by Allah, fattakallah mastata'tum, be conscious of Allah as much as you're able. So in whatever circumstance that they are in, they find ways of connecting to Allah in ways that we couldn't even begin to imagine. We take so much for granted. Making wudu, we take for granted. Being able to sleep in a comfortable space, we take it all for granted. Waking up, having an alarm clock to wake up for Fajr. My friend Babar Ahmed, when he was in prison in the US, he used to titrate drinking water, enough water that it would force him to wake up at exactly the sweet spot for Fajr. So initially he drank one bottle to see like when him having to go to the toilet would require him waking up, and then he drank two, and then he kept on drinking the right amount of water until he figured, okay, if I drink this much water, it will make me go to the toilet this many hours later. It's like, who would even think of that? Because he's in complete isolation, no access to a clock, no access to an alarm clock, no access to a fellow prisoner to help wake him up if he needs waking or whatever, no guards that are going to do that for him. We don't even think about this stuff, and so it wasn't one of the intentions of the book, but I do hope that inshallah, when people, if they get a chance to read the book, especially coming up to Ramadan now, one of the things that they'll think about is, what stops me? What stops me in my ibadah? What stops me from connecting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What stops me from making dhikr? It's definitely one of the things that I took from it, because you were left with feeling a great deal of personal shame when you read about these people and what they've been through.
No, I can. I'm feeling like referral shame right now listening to these people and these incredible people in there and them dealing with this crisis with such dignity and with such poise and being conscious of our Creator Allah. Um, it's just very astounding, I think, for a lot of listeners right now to hear, because in Pakistan, I think the security apparatus is not as brutalizing historically as we have in some of the Arab regimes or in Egypt or North Africa. To hear that Muslims would torture fellow Muslims at the behest of some Western hegemony or whatever. Was the situation in Egyptian prisons similar, worse, or better than the situation in Guantanamo?
This is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this kind of exercise of having two different jurisdictions that we were able to tell stories from. And I'm very familiar with Guantanamo, worked in a lot of cases. I'm familiar a little bit with Egypt, but not as much. But Wala, my co-author, she was very familiar with Egypt. And it was interesting. I wrote all the sections on Guantanamo and the American kind of prison sites, and she did all the ones on Egypt. So when I read her drafts as they were coming through, my concern was that people would come away thinking, "Oh, the Americans are so much better than the Egyptians." And this is a reality. I do feel like her sections of the book are worse than the ones that I wrote. Don't get me wrong; like what the Americans did was awful. It was utterly awful. It was completely dehumanizing, degrading. It is torture in every single sense of the word that you can possibly imagine. But there is this added layer of Muslims and those who purport to be Muslim doing the torture. the kind of people that will torture you for a session and then pray in front of you because they realize that the time for salah is running out. You know, that for me, when I read those sections of the book, it just left me very, very angry and upset, because you can understand why a non-Muslim nation would kind of behave this way. You know, would instrumentalize your Islam against you, try and hurt your Islam. But there are certain things that should be sacrosanct. And, you know, we start with an epigraph from one of the interviews in Egypt, where one of the Egyptian interrogators says to a prisoner, you know, in this prison, we're like God. We're the ones who say kun fayakun, right? And that kind of like that arrogance that they have is really quite damning. And it tells you a lot. Again, we're going back to this idea, and in fact, the last chapter of the book, conclusion of the book, specifically is on how the surveillance state, the national security state that all of these countries are, is a deified being, because they believe that they are completely righteous in everything that they do, because they are indoctrinated to believe that they are completely righteous in their torture, in their abuse, in everything, in every aspect of their surveillance and in incarceration systems. And it's really quite disgusting.
Yeah, there's a totalizing effect that the nation state seems to have, where it takes away any individual agency from said torturer or interrogator, where he's doing this for the sake of the state and the state is right, and any violence committed by the state is the haqq. This is the sort of default position which does not even need to be, verbalized or said. It just is. That's the base assumption, that even in the Muslim world, the average citizen sort of makes that, the state is committing this violence, so it's right. The state has to do it.
Right. And but they have religious cover for it.
Sure.
So for example, in Egypt, the executions that took place against political prisoners, they have to be stamped by the Grand Mufti of Al Azhar. So Shoki Alam is the final stamp, which tells you what? That this murder, this state-sanctioned murder, is religiously sanctified. It's such an important element to the entire process, because they want you to know that not only
even if it's a rubber stamp,
right,
even if it's a rubber
even
stamp,
if it's a rubber, they want everybody to know that God has sanctioned
Subhanallah.
this murder.
Subhanallah.
And that's why the nation state is so deified and sanctified.
I'm so glad
as a structure.
God came down to Al Azhar or the Egyptian parliament or the Egyptian judiciary to tell them which Ikhwan Muslimin members to execute and which to leave. This sort of divine characteristic that the nation state has taken up, to expect it from the West is but natural, post Enlightenment, post the secular Reformation, but for the Muslim world, do you think that we've had a sort of a reformation, a silent reformation, and that we've become like them in our attitudes about the state and the way we organize, and that there is no difference? In fact, we might be worse off than them in this structure. Was that the feeling that you got?
Yeah. So I don't believe that we've ever had a post-colonial moment. I don't believe in post-colonialism. I think all of our countries are continuities of colonization, because we took the apparatus and the structure of a very colonial policing and legal system, and we applied it to this new nation state that we built, but never removing all of the violent and harmful policies that came with it. So, for example, if you look at the work of people like Iza Hussein, who wrote an excellent book called The Politics of Islamic Law, where she looked at Malaya, India, and Egypt, and the way in which you have this ossification of laws, especially criminal laws, and the restructuring of the politics and the judiciary according to certain kind of colonial hierarchies. What you see is a sharp increase in the numbers of people being prosecuted, of being convicted, of jail sentences, of jail terms, of state-sanctioned executions, because what they've done is that what was a very kind of fluid, moving system of judicial making was replaced with a very, very hard, octified, and concrete set of laws that don't allow for that leeway that our traditions built into them. And so it's really important that we understand that all of our societies are effectively structured on the lines of a very, very violent colonial structure, which we never repealed in its entirety. We maintained its system of policing. We maintained its system of surveillance. And so with that comes, of course, all the violence that constitutes part of that. It's not that we kind of established a democracy and from there everything else flowed, right? That still would have been somewhat better in some ways. But what we did is that we just said, okay, chalo, this is what the British left for us. Let's maintain those structures and try and kind of like democratize it a little bit. That's really what happened.
Are the Egyptian people aware of the kind of atrocities? Because considering that they've had a long history with dictatorships, are they aware of what goes on in their prison systems under CC? And are they silent out of fear? Is it a quiet sort of approval of said behavior? Are people enamored with the idea of the state? Because Pakistan has enjoyed a kind of certain, jingoistic nationalism where the army and the state can do no wrong, and a lot of those myths have been broken multiple times. But it's an ongoing relationship. Is it the same in Egypt, or are people aware of it? Like, do you have any data or any on ground, anecdotes from people being scared by this, or glib with, or happy about these kinds of tortures?
I think it's a complicated. I lived in Egypt myself, so I have like personal experience of living there, living amongst the people. I lived in Medina Nasser as well, which is kind of where Amna Dola is located, so the state security infrastructure. This is Mubarak era, so before the coup took place and before Morsi's election. There's a great deal of fear. While you're there, you know that there are certain topics that you cannot simply speak about. That period that I lived there was the least political in my entire life. I was there to learn my Arabic, and that was it. Like, I was there for a purpose. And all of my political activity, all of my political discussions, they completely dropped off the radar completely, because you don't know who's an informant. It's the same in Jordan. It was the same in Syria. Inshallah, hopefully Syria has a chance to try something different, I hope. We don't know. We'll see. Kind of turning up at Davos doesn't necessarily, inspire massive hope in that project. But alhamdulillah, they won their freedom from Assad, which is a great thing. And out of all of the countries, it was the country that I thought was least likely in my lifetime to see liberation. So, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's plan is clearly greater than anything any of us can conceive of. But yeah, unfortunately, we do talk about this in the book a little bit too, where there were people who were reporting on protesters who were hiding away from the military. So not only were they silent, but in some instances they were complicit in ensuring that people were arrested and ultimately tortured. And Egyptians know that if you're getting arrested by state security, you are getting tortured. It's not like they don't know. They know. In the same way that Pakistanis know as well, that for a certain type of crime, there is potentially a sanction that comes at the other end of it. Like, you kind of know for certain types of crimes, then there might be a little bit
in
of pain at
Pakistan,
the other end of it.
the fortunate element is that the worst thing that can happen to you in a majority of cases, and I'm speaking hyperbolically, obviously, there are incidents of torture and other abuses, and the worst thing that happens to you is that you get abducted, and they'll
Right.
beat you with sticks or whatever, maybe once or twice, and then they'll sort of just put you in a box to sit
Right.
there. And I'm not downplaying the torture of being isolated or living alone in those kinds of circumstances, or being away from your family, or being abducted. But some of these things I hear out of Syria or Egypt. This is not within the Pakistani imagination. Secondly,
So
this
there are
idea of
periods.
people
Yeah.
reporting on fellow citizens. This is not something that I've ever experience. Like even with the recent protests, and there's been up to claimed it's been claimed that up to 10,000 political prisoners have been taken in the last 2 years. Nobody reports on anyone.
Mm.
There's been no there's no there is the idea that you don't want anyone getting caught by the state. you know I don't know if that's we have a non-serious attitude towards the law. I don't know if it's a loyalty to kith and kin, or but there's definitely not this attitude of like, let's get those protesters caught and then being gleeful about their torture or potential torture. This is strange.
Right. Right, yeah. I mean, even when the early abductions took place, where a lot of people got sent to Guantanamo,
Just one correction, actually.
even
The most,
yeah,
sorry, it's one correction. The most
yeah, sure.
perversion that you get in Pakistani society is something that we call software update. That is one glib thing that we do have. Software update is code or slang for if you were being mouthy about certain ideas, that you were expressing certain political opinions that aren't accepted in the narrative, and then you were abducted and beaten, and then you had a statement of rescinding your ideas or whatever. That is called a software update. There is a glibness in a certain crowd about those kinds of things. That
Mm.
so and so was being very, and then they had their software updated. It's like I think it's an extension of that sort of WhatsApp Uncle G, good morning dear kind of like
Right, right, right.
language. So that is the maximum amount of like perverted gleefulness about other people's misery that I've seen, but nothing as bad as reporting actual dissidents to the government.
Yeah. Look, one thing I'll say is that 2002, 2003, when a lot of foreign nationals were being abducted by Pakistani security agencies and military and being sold to the Americans. The captors would often say to the brothers, "Hum majboor hain," like that. They would try and apologize in that
Yeah.
way. That like, we're sorry, we can't do anything about this situation. Not that they were forgiven. Trust me, if you read the book, you'll see the brothers are very angry about it, and they don't forgive them. And they say that we will take our haqq from you in the akhirah, right? Like, don't get it twisted. You know, we don't accept your apology in this circumstance. We don't care how majboor you think you are in this moment, which is their right, because they're the ones who are being sold into a system that they lost like years and years and years of their lives to. But that was interesting for me, that they felt that sense of that they knew it was wrong, that they knew it was wrong. What they were doing was wrong. Whereas you're right,
Listen, don't get me wrong. They
with
took the
Egypt
money.
and Jordan,
They took the
yeah,
money. They
they took
and
them.
it was almost like a self-soothing kind of situation. Like hum majboor hain ji dekhein. It was,
Right.
and I do appreciate the brothers and sisters who were abducted and not forgiving their facilitators. I completely agree with that. But I think it was more of a self-soothing because they knew that this what we're doing is messed up on so many levels.
Right, right. But it is different to say, for example, like Egyptian security forces, or like even Ali Guma, who was the Grand Mufti of Egypt during the Rabat massacres, writing a fatwa or kind of delivering a speech saying that the protesters were Kalab al-Nar, right? Saying that these are Khawarij, that they're the dogs of the hellfire, that you're permitted effectively to kill them. So that's much more serious because it's direct. It's trying to present an ideological framework that allows for the dehumanization of others. At least, these guys, at the very least, if we're going to say that,
The Kalab and Nar stuff,
yeah.
we picked up on that stuff as well during the War on Terror era. It never caught
Mhm.
on, thankfully. It's being repeated again, unfortunately, now to galvanize Pakistani sort of sentiments against Afghanistan again. And the Khawarij narrative, that the dissidents in the north are Khawarij and Baloch dissidents are Khawarij, and there's a religious reason why we have to fight against them or whatever. The idea of the sanctity of the state being sacrosanct and being sort of equivalent to the preservation of the deen. This is sort of thing that in the popular Muslim imagination I think is It's starting to break down in Pakistan. I think people aren't trusting the government with these narratives, and for the wrong reasons in most of the time, because they were PTI supporters and they feel slighted by the government nowadays. But for one reason or another, they are questioning it. I do see more and more people questioning it, because when I was younger and they pumped out this BS during the war on terror, people bought it, and our elders bought it. Unfortunately, I don't think they bought it wholeheartedly, but they did buy it on mass.
Yeah, yeah,
And
like with the SWAT operation, like in the early
yes,
2000s and
yes,
things like that. Yeah,
yes,
absolutely. Like they were told, this is jihad fi sabilillah,
yes,
go forth and,
yeah.
there's no sin on you for killing like
the
Muslims there.
the only criticism that came out at that time was the most vocal voice. I think was the leader of the then Jamaat Islami, who is passed away. He openly vocalized on TV that I don't think this is jihad, and I don't think we're shaheed when we
Right.
die. And I think and the response to that at that time was
That was
so.
Qazi Hussein.
Not Qazi Hussain. It was the other gentleman, the Urdu speaking gentleman from Karachi. I'm forgetting his name. He The response to that was so overwhelmingly negative at that time from the sort of the public sphere that it led me to believe that, oh, people are buying this at that time. But
Right.
now, even though an opinion is not vocalized on TV or on mainstream media, but on the street, people are believe in it, where they're like, this isn't right. We shouldn't fight each other. Again, I could be wrong. People might be, a couple of terrorist attacks away from being completely convinced of the opposite. But so that's the Muslim case, and the situation with Egypt, right? What about the Americans? Do you think that they had trepidations and with their torture and treatment of these people? What did the detainees report back from their captors?
Um, so there's different phases of the detention. The detention now isn't anywhere near as torturous as it was at the beginning. By the beginning, it was particularly bad. They were taught, they were told, as they're being told right now about the migrants who are being sent now. There's 30,000 of them that they're planning to send to Guantanamo Bay. These are the worst of the worst, right? So there's a whole dehumanizing narrative that's built into it. Um, and they were very, very carefully taught about how to harm Muslim men in particular. So they were relied on the works of people like Raphael Patai, who wrote The Arab Mind, in order to try and target Muslim beliefs and behaviors. There's a book by one of the interrogators named Eric Saar called Behind the Wire, where he describes a moment where a female interrogator is trying to like sexually entice a detainee in a cell. She's kind of flashing herself at him, in all sorts of lewd ways, rubbing herself up against him, and he spits at on her face when she gets, too close to him. So she, kind of rushes out and goes to the Arab kind of cultural specialist at the outside, and he says to her, she says, "How do I break this guy?" He says, "You break him by pretending to smear menstrual blood on him and then turning off the taps to his cell." So she goes back in and like with some red ink and she like puts it all over him and whatever and says, "That's my menstrual blood." So Eric Saar is the one as an interrogator himself, who's describing all of this, and he was like one of the early whistleblowers. He didn't agree with these tactics in particular, and so that's just one example of the kind of thing that was happening on a regular basis. They knew exactly how to harm these men. It was interesting. There's another scenario where there were like three British brothers who end up being penned with a group of Afghans. And so what the Americans did was that they tried to show these Afghans, they thought everyone was like from Afghanistan. So they just started like flashing pornographic images at them to try and like, harm their sense of like, kind of shame and honor and whatever else. But they didn't realize these British brothers were in the group. So when they came in front of the British guys were like, oh, I recognize that picture. that's your mother. I was with her last week, right? Like they've grown up in the UK. They've seen like images like this before. They're like desensitized to some of this stuff, right? So it's not like that they were looking at it purposefully, but they were just trying to like, show a bit of bravado in that moment, which is like, what are you trying to do to us, right? Like, the Afghan guys, they're probably from like villages and whatever else. They don't look upon these, kind of things and whatever else, right? But like, it's everywhere in this society. So they kind of, it was just very, very different. The attempt to harm them in their face just came
a lot of
across culturally
sexual stuff,
differently.
a lot of sexual stuff
A
in
lot
there
of
as well.
sexual stuff. A lot of sexual stuff. And what's really interesting with when we wrote the chapter on torture in the book, I was able to split my section into like cultural humiliation and sexual humiliation, but she wasn't able to make that distinction. All of the torture in Egypt is some variety of sexual humiliation, all of it, and that really comes across very strongly in what she wrote. There is some kind of like grossness that's there that is unfortunately part of the security apparatus that very much is endemic to Egyptian
No, it also
carceral
seems to be.
systems.
I would disagree with you, brother. I think it seems to be some sort of universal default for the
Mm,
nation state that they sexually humiliate their detainees
right,
across the world. We see this in the Muslim as well as the non-Muslim world. There seems to be, if you
right,
look at the situation in India, in Kashmir, or with other dissident communities, if you look at the situation in Syria, for example, if you look at it in Guantanamo, like you mentioned, with this
mm,
woman like just debasing herself, not in her torture, also sort of torturing her own. I can imagine
right,
that this is not a well person now. This is not somebody who's okay in the head, because why would you flash someone with your private parts, even if you are some very liberated Western woman? It's just dehumanizing to yourself as well.
right, absolutely.
But this seems to be a common thread that nation states and intelligence apparatus across the world have figured out that they either use sexuality as compromise and compromat material, or as a torture device to humiliate and to denigrate people. With men, it's very easy, the sort of anally or rectally to probe them, or rape them in sort of different with devices or tools, or with actual humans as well. And with women, I think the shaming of women by removing their clothing, I think that's a horrible enough start where people tend to crack after that point. But this is a common
Right.
thread to violate the dignity of the individual's sexuality and their privacy. This seems to be a common thread with the nation state. There's
We
not
saw
a
the
single
images of
case.
Abu
Yeah.
Ghraib.
Yes.
With Abu Ghraib, there are a lot of like hypersexualized images.
Naked men on top
A
of each
lot of
other. Yeah.
yeah. And then when the Senate committee did their report on the CIA black sites, they wrote about something called they were calling rectal rehydration, which was effectively like kind of rape of these men, and there was absolutely no medical reason for doing it, right? So they were trying to claim, the CIA, that there was a medical purpose for this rectal rehydration. It was just torture. That's all it was. But they come up with these euphemisms. So enhanced interrogation techniques is a euphemism for torture. Rectal rehydration is a euphemism for anal rape. They have ways of trying to like talk about this to make it sound normal, so liberals can be okay with themselves.
What about American society? There was a moment, like a brief moment, where they were horrified and shocked by the images coming out of Guantanamo and the different black sites. And then, like that, like the media cycle moved on, and it's out of the average sort of psyche in the Western world. Um, do you think there's sort of a celebration or glibness towards the kind of tortures that the Western world did in the Muslim world or with Muslims? Or is there a recognition of the fact that they're breaking the liberal order themselves? Yani with their own hands, they're destroying the rules that they set out for themselves. Do they recognize now that maybe, for example, I often quote this to Western journalists or any academics that I meet, white types, I ask them about Anwar al-Awlaki, and are you aware that killing American citizens for whatever reason is going to eventually turn around to you, as an individual? Um, do you think they realize what they've done, like the average public?
I think they're coming to terms with that now. You know, we have to remind ourselves that Trump, everything that Trump is doing right now is based on everything that happened before him. When you fail to hold torturers to account, when you fail to hold police officers who kill young black men for no reason to account, when you permit for people to be detained in custody, uh, you know, without charge or trial, on spurious immigration matters as the liberals, then the next government is going to build up of everything that you did. It's interesting with this Guantanamo sequence we're seeing right now, the 30,000 refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants that are going to be sent to Guantanamo Bay now, according to Trump. I literally today found out that the office that was tendering contracts for private security companies to manage that entire system started under the Biden administration. They were already talking about taking 10,000 Haitian refugees and housing them at Guantanamo Bay. So everybody's like super like angry now, like, oh, Trump's done this. But Biden was already trying. He was already putting the architecture in place for this to happen. And so one of the things that we have to do is not see America as, kind of these two parties fighting with one another. We have to see it as, everything that we see is on a continuum. Even there's a documentary about Guantanamo and Haitian refugees that came out in 2017. And Harold Coe is like talking about how terrible it was that the Haitian refugees were treated in Guantanamo Bay this way. Harold Coe is the legal advisor that okayed targeted assassination, extrajudicial killings by drone. People like Anwar al-Awlaki, he's the one who literally wrote the legal memorandum justifying it for the Obama administration. And so this is the thing about liberals. You have to contend with the world that you created because you refused to stand by your own values and to, kind of respect the rule of law. And so, because they're always worried, right? Oh, if we start prosecuting these people for X, Y, and Z, what happens when they come into power? What will happen to us for the misdeeds that we made? And so the liberal order protects itself largely most of the time. Trump was somewhat of an exception to that, where they actually went after him, but very quickly realized, oh, we made a mistake. And so then you have this whole kind of panicked period of Biden where he says that I'm not going to interfere with my son's own prosecution and conviction, right? He's saying that consistently until the last days when he gives his entire family an amnesty or immunity from any further prosecution because of the environment they've now created. And so what we're going to see more and more now, I think, is that entire infrastructure of injustice that they've created becomes self-cannibalistic. It's now going to turn in on itself, finally. After all these years of being directed towards people of color and minority communities and others, it's now going to start probably cannibalizing effectively white America, liberal white America.
Yeah, I think
and that's going to be very unfortunate for a lot of them.
I agree. I think it's already started in a lot of ways. A lot of funny incidents have come forward with Trump voters and their spouses being deported as well because they weren't. Saw some of those. That's very funny. So, in essence, the sort of unspoken rule that was within nation states for the past 50, 60 years, everything has come to light. The average public knows what's been going on in the prison systems, in detention sites against dissidents and so-called terrorists or rebels or whatever. Do you think that there is enough of a self-correction mechanism in this system that it would, within the current framework, that it would be able to self-correct for these past injustices? Or do you think it is going to be one of those things that adds fuel to the fire, which is going to burn all this down?
I mean, I don't think there's a historical model that teaches us that when you get to this level of injustice, that people just turn around and say, "Oh wait, hold on a second, we're really sorry. We got it so wrong all of these years. Like this mass incarceration of black people that you see, we're gonna stop all that. We're gonna like reverse that trend completely. We're gonna all this Islamophobia that we see, all these like laws that we put into place where we're taking people's citizenships away from them, we're deporting them, we're locking them up, we're sending them off to prison islands. Our bad. We got it wrong. We're going to stop that entirely. And I just don't see it. I think that what's going to happen is that that architecture is going to be consistently built on. What's going to be really fascinating to see is because the Republicans have majority in the two houses and they have the Supreme Court, is whether or not Trump will make some kind of play to extend his terms. That will be really fascinating to see, because I don't think anybody thinks for a moment that that's not a possibility. Like, is there going to be some kind of attempt at doing that? And if there is, then we'll see what happens in America then. But already, like, it's really interesting seeing like liberals on social media. I don't know if you're on this app called Blue Sky, but Blue Sky, like, it's where everybody who was on Twitter who was liberal fled to.
Oh, really?
Right. So
Okay. No, I don't know.
yeah, I went on there. I don't really use it, but I went on there, and like my first 24 hours in it was wild, because it was just like a whole stream of liberals saying the resistance begins here. This is where the resistance starts. Like Star Trek memes, not Star Trek, Star Wars
Star
memes,
Wars,
and
yeah.
God knows what else. Yeah, what else was going on? And I was just
So,
watching it saying, this is
so
wild, because you have no idea
yeah,
what the resistance looks like
looks
for
like
us.
it came,
Right, for you, the resistance
it
looks like,
it smacked you in the face and you didn't recognize it. You saw it
right.
in the last 30, 40 years, that's what I, by the way, like all these Star Wars like references, like the those tiny people on at the end of Empire. What is those little like
The Ewoks.
the Ewoks? Yeah,
Ewoks. Yeah.
just these like technologically disabled, sort of backwards, forest people fighting back against the Empire. I was like, you saw it all over the Muslim world, like these, where these tiny forest people who live in little huts, and we have to fight this guerrilla war, and you know,
Right.
uh,
The little Mukhtars everywhere.
yeah, little Muhtars everywhere, and these guys they're just completely blind to this, completely blind to the
Right.
imagery, and like the empire is supposed to be the Nazis or whatever, right?
Right.
Um,
Right. Right.
they're completely blind to it. That from that Mitchell and Webb show, that there's that one, "Are we the baddies?" Like the Nazis sort of figuring out.
I haven't seen that. Okay.
There's this one.
I have
There's
to
this
watch that.
one bit of them where they're the Nazis and they're wearing the skull uniforms, and they're like, "We have skulls on our uniforms. Are we the baddies?" It's just a complete lack of
Yeah.
self-awareness, and
Look, yeah, I don't want to gloat. And I think gloating's helpful in the sense that
it's cathartic.
ultimately
But
we will still be harmed first before anybody else is, right?
alhamdulillah,
Like
yeah.
whatever policies come into place, yeah, that's going to come at us, but it's already been happening to us, so we're much more resilient in that sense. We know what dehumanized policy making and legislation looks like. We know what it looks like to get stopped at an airport and be questioned about your faith and whatever, right? It's now going to start happening to a whole group of people who are never ready for it, who never thought that this could be a
No.
material reality in their lives. And that's going to be really interesting to see what happens with that. And I think that, people can choose to be humble, or they can be like all these liberals who are going out and saying, oh, like we hope that you're happy with Trump. Yeah, Genocide Joe was bad. You were going on about Genocide Joe, but now you're
No.
gonna have to like suffer
None
the
of that. None of that.
consequences
None
of
of
what
that.
Trump does. Like, we were already suffering the consequences of the Democrats.
I think what you're, yeah,
Like,
I think
this really affects you more than anyone
we lived
else.
through the Obama years. And I think what you're
Right.
actually saying is that, I think people will now be sympathetic to the brown dad sort of scolding his kids at the airport, having, travel anxiety because, he has everyone's passports tightly clutched in his paw. Because nobody traveled like us. And nobody traveled like us, and nobody got the bomb swipes, those swab things for bomb residue, and triple S status on our tickets and boarding passes and separate, interrogation rooms, anywhere, going anywhere,
Right.
and these restrictions on travel, these restrictions on the freedom of movement, these restrictions on abductions and jail time as a threat for the Muslim world. We've experienced it for the past 200 years now, and I think it's really ramped up in the past 30, 40 years in the war on terror. But and like you said, that the scope and scale of this is expanding. Do you think that in the Muslim world, this as a weapon has become sort of ineffectual? Like we saw with Syria, like we see in Pakistan with the political dissidents of the PTI or other political parties. Uh, we're seeing a wave across the Muslim world where people don't seem to be scared of it anymore. Do you think the tool won't work, or do you think it's still as effective a weapon in the arsenal of the state?
I'm not sure that's right. I think Syria was, a decade long, 12 years of intense battling to win a freedom, and really only made possible by Tufan al-Aqsa. When we think about it, the only reason that actually Syria is free today, well, not the only reason, of course, astaghfirullah, because they worked very hard for it, but Tufan al-Aqsa, it distracts Hezbollah, who are concentrating on their own land. Obviously, Russia was already, kind of distracted by what's going on in Ukraine, kind of problem of their own making. And so, there was a confluence of circumstances that allowed for it. But I was in Pakistan last year, I was in Lahore last year, and Karachi, and there was a palpable sense of fear amongst many of the people that I was speaking to, people who are like heavily involved in PTI, people who are card-carrying members of PTI, who want to do the right thing, but are fearful for their children, are fearful for the consequences of what that means going forward. And I think that's one of the things that always concerns me about Pakistan, because of the way that Pakistan as a country is divided into these different regions, because largely a Punjab centric authority has abused them in manifold ways. It's difficult to bring about a genuine kind of like people's movement or resistance movement to existing colonial structures. And that, in some ways, that's purposeful. In many ways, that's purposeful, which is why you have such a strong military in the country. It's the only thing that people can get fully behind as a force, because it's easier. It's easier that way. Whereas, reality is that like Pakistan is a mukhabarat state. Ultimately, it's no different than in some ways to Egypt or Turkey. It's really interesting because I actually think there's so many similarities between Egypt and Pakistan. And you mentioned some of the differences, and I accept those as well. Like, I don't think that torture is as bad in Pakistan as it is in Egypt, for instance. But there's many similarities to Turkey as well in the way that its army and its security agencies operate. And when I think about all of that, I think about there's a lot of potential, but also what these structures do is that they limit our ambitions too. Words like Ummah, ultimately, they're a platitude in our religious discourse. For the general person, really more so than anything else, it means maximum, like being involved in like boycotting campaigns or standing up at protests, or perhaps giving sadaqah or zakah to those who are more needy. But that's as far as Ummah goes, right? That's like the extent of an ummatic ambition for the vast majority of the Muslim world. But if you speak to people, they're like, yeah, we'd love like a unified, federated Muslim world, it's there. It's there, and I've seen it. I've seen it across all of the travels that I've had across them. I remember being in like the northwest province of Pakistan and being this little village in Ramadan, and the Imam is like crying his eyes out for Palestine in his qunut. And I remember being in that moment and making dua behind him and thinking to myself, this guy has no connection to that place whatsoever in his daily life. Like, he's literally just like, he's got a shop. Okay, that's how he like does his like, earns his daily keep and whatever else. The problems that exist in his life have nothing to do with Zionism as an ideology, as a structure, nothing to do with America, nothing to do with any of this stuff whatsoever. But like the extent of emotion, and like that's where you find like the Ummah as a palpable thing. Now, how you mechanistically bring that about is like it's a completely different, kind of conversation. But at least it's there amongst the general masses, and that's what I hold on to. Having traveled around so much of the Muslim world, I hold on to this thing, which is okay. At least in the hearts of people, the idea of a thing, some kind of polity that does not permit us to separate ourselves on any line other than our love of Allah and our love of the Prophet ﷺ is a remarkable thing.
It truly is, and a conversation for another time. But Dr. Asim, thank you so much for your time, and I hope it wasn't too meandering and all over the place.
No, absolutely. I enjoyed the conversation. I really appreciate your thoughts as well. So, I appreciate the time to be able to kind of talk to you and to all of your viewers as well, inshallah.
How can people reach you on Blue Sky? What was it?
So I don't really use it, but I'm on X.
They can reach you on X and Twitter.
Right. Yeah, but do look at our work. The URL is www.cage.ngo. Follow the work that Cage does, inshallah. Try and support it in whatever way you can, inshallah.
Yes, no, thank you so much for your time. Jazakallah khair.